Okay, this video is going to be about JavaScript expressions. We're going back to the basics here. We're going to touch on literals, variables, and operators as well. Okay, so I have a JavaScript program here in my dev folder. I called it Expressions. I've got to open an atom, and it's just a JS file, expressions.js. That's JavaScript. So with JS files, we can just run them directly with Node.js. Node.js is installed by default on the CS server, or you can install it yourself on your own computer by going to the Node.js website. It's really easy to install, and it's kind of nice, so you can work on stuff without having to log into the CS server. So if you don't have an internet connection or something, you can still work on homeworks and stuff like that. Okay, so just go to nodejs.org and you can download it and install it there. Okay, once you have it installed, type node --version. Version is an option to the node command. It tells you the version of node you're running. Alright, but node is the command that you use to execute programs. So if we want to execute a JavaScript program, first we got to change directories to my dev folder that's on my desktop. Desktop/dev /l. There's expressions, and I type node, the name of the file, and press enter, and that's it. That's all you have to do to execute the JavaScript. Okay, so I have these console log statements. So this is basically just a heading I made for the console log, so it looks pretty. Expression. So a JavaScript expression is any valid set of literals, variables, operators, or other expressions that evaluate to a single value. Okay, so to figure out what that means, we need to talk about each one of these things. So a literal, in computer science, a literal is a notation for representing a fixed value in source code. There we go. Okay, so that means basically a literal is anything you type out that's not, you can't change it. Once I type this in the source code, it's there. It's the number 5. I can't change it to something else because in the source code I actually have written down 5. Same with 98.6, -42.1. It's a literal value. It can't be changed. Some other literal values, these are number literals. This is a string literal. We've already seen a lot of string literals. It's anything with quotes around it. So all of these things in these console.logs are string literals. You can't change them. They're stored in memory and they stay that way until your program ends. Okay? So some examples of string literals, ABC and hello. There's another type of literal, it's called Boolean. It's true or false. That's helpful in branching logic when you're making a program and based on some condition. Say the user has registered for your site or something, they have to register before they can do something. So you would set a variable, is user registered, right? And that can change from true to false depending on what they've done. Okay, and then your code can check that variable. If it's true, it does some code, and if it isn't true, or if it's false, it does some other code. All right, so that's the Boolean literal. There's also object literals. So object literals are more complicated. Almost everything in JavaScript is an object. The exception of these primitives. There's a few more primitives, but we don't need to know about them. A primitive is basically a non-object value. It's a very simple value. Okay, an object is defined using curly brackets. So this is an empty object. There's nothing in it. This is an object that has two properties. It has an A property and a B property. The value of the A property is the string literal apple, and the value of the B property is the string literal 2. We're not going to do a lot with objects yet, but I want to expose you to them initially so you're not confused totally when you see them later. So you have the property name, colon, and then the value. Property name, colon, and then a value. So this is a number value because there's no string around it, or no quotes around it, and this is a string literal value. Okay. There's also a concept of an array of data. Like the object is stored two pieces of data, but they were named. This is A, and the piece of data was apple, and the other piece of data was named B, and the value was 2. With an array, it's multiple pieces of data, but they aren't named. So it's just a list of different bits of data. So the first, this is an empty array. It's used with square brackets. This array starts, the first item in the array is 5, the second item is 7, and the third item is this string chicken. Okay, that's a string literal. Alright, and these are array literals and object literals because they have written out explicitly in code. And then there's also a function literal. So everything under here is considered an object in JavaScript. An array is just a special kind of object. A function is just a special kind of object. Okay, so that's important to know. But these are all literals. It's things that you write in your source code that cannot change. Alright, so we've checked off literals. And we're talking about a JavaScript expression. It's a set of literals, variables, and operators, and other expressions. So let's move on to variables. Okay. Variables are constructs used to store data within a program. Variables can be created using the following keywords. The only one you really need to know is var. These are more advanced. They've come up in future versions of the language. The language is ever evolving. These keywords are more important when you're coding something with a team of people. But for now we're just going to stick with var because it's easy to remember. Var, variable. So we'll go with that. Alright. So here's first example. We have var. We're declaring a variable here. And this is the name of the variable. So this is a variable declaration. The name must start with an alphabetical character or an underscore. It can contain numbers, but it cannot start with a number. Alright, so we're declaring the variable CS151 URL. That lets the program know whenever we type this, we're referencing a variable. Okay. Variables can also not be named keywords, so you can't have a variable named var, and you can't have a variable named function. Okay, so if you want to store a function in a variable, call it like fn or something like that, or spell out variable if you wanted to name it variable, but you can't use the keywords. Okay. There we go. Okay, so we console.log, this is a string literal, comma, so this is the first argument we're passing to the log function, and the second argument is this variable. It's telling JavaScript, hey, when you get to this line of code, instead of actually printing out this is a keyword now because we declared it, look for this variable and see what I stored inside and print that. Okay, so think of variables like a bucket or a suitcase or something. It stores something. Okay, you put it in boxes. Variables are boxes that store data. Alright, so So let's save this and clear the terminal with the clear command, and let's run node. Okay, so here's our literals. Computer science, a literal is a notation for representing a fixed value in source code. These are printed out. It's an object. Property name, colon, value. Property name, colon, value. This is an array. It's an unnamed collection of values. So it's just 5, 7, and then chicken. And then a function, we just defined an empty function here. It doesn't do anything. You can still call the function, but notice it doesn't have a name. This is why it's a function literal. It's an unnamed function, and you can, in JavaScript, you can even store functions in variables. Okay, they call that first-class citizens. Functions are first-class citizens. All right, so variables, var, let, and const. Here's our URL, console.log URL, and then it's looking in this variable. What do we have stored in there? We have this string literal stored in there, and so it displays it here. Okay, so I did an example using the let keyword, which is just another way to define a variable, and I added a Boolean value. I set it as a Boolean value. So let is a keyword that defines a variable. The next thing you add is the name of the variable. Then you add the equal symbol. The equal symbol is an assignment operator. We're assigning a value to this variable. Okay, and the value is false. Okay, it's important to know that you can declare a variable without assigning it. Console.log is process complete. There we go. Okay, is process complete. I'm going to log that right away, and I didn't assign a value. Okay, let's run it again. In JavaScript, if a variable has not been assigned a value, it is undefined. Undefined is a special data type in JavaScript. So whenever you see undefined, that generally means you have a variable that wasn't declared with a value. It doesn't have anything in it. Or it can be, if I declare an object, just an empty object here, no properties, and then I do console.log object.b. It's going to look for a property named b on object, but there aren't any properties on object, so that will be undefined as well. So if we run this, undefined, undefined. Okay. So we have this Boolean is process complete. So Booleans are true or false, and they're common for if you're running something on a website and the user needs to complete some process before they can go on to the next section of the website. You have a Boolean, and it can change based on what the user does. If they complete the certain thing that you want them to, you would change this to false in the program, or to true in the program, and then it would check to see if they completed the thing and run a certain block of code if they had. If they had not completed it, it might tell them, I'm sorry, you can't go to this website because you haven't completed this thing. Okay, it's called branching logic. So Booleans are very important. They're used with branching logic and if statements. So if this thing has happened, or if this is true, do this code. Otherwise, do some other code. That's kind of the concept. Okay, so run it again. Is process complete? What does it say? Oh, I declared it twice. Okay, so this is important. You can only declare the variable once. This is the declaration with the var and the name. Let and the name, or const and the name. Since I already declared it, it threw an error and said you can't declare it twice. So I can still change the value of it, I just can't put var in front because it's already been declared. Okay, you only declare it once. So identifier is process complete has already been declared. So whenever you see that, that means that, oh, I used var twice on the same variable. And the more you see these errors, the more you'll get used to knowing what they mean. Okay, and it even shows you in the code here, and it says 54, that's on line 54. On Atom, your lines are numbered, and you can see I had var here. Okay, so when you run it and you get an error, this is the name of the file that you're running. This is the line on which the error occurred, and it even points to where it is. And then this is the error itself, and it gives you information about it, and we can go into that later. Alright, so we fixed our error and we run it. Made a new one. Okay, process has completed. False. Is process complete? We had set it to false, so that's right. The other way to define a variable is with const. Again, this is your declaration. And with const, you do have to set a value as soon as you declare it. The idea with const is you can't change this value. And it's more important when you're coding with other people. If you have a variable that it's really important that they never change in the program somewhere else in the code, you make it a const, and then it throws an error if they try to change it. So let's log out days per year. It's 365. So you'd never want to change that because that's always the same, right? It's never going to be like 500. So if we save this, run the code, days is 365. Now let's try to change it and see what happens. So we're taking days per year, and we're going to set it equal to 500. Now this should throw an error. Assignment to constant variable. Const stands for constant, means it shouldn't change. Okay. Again, we're mostly just going to be using var, but it's important that you know that these exist. Alright. So that's the const. Now we'll set an object to a variable. Here's a very simple object. Let's say I have student data. That's kind of similar to what I do when I grade with you guys. I have objects that represent each one of you. Okay, so this is a student object, and we're declaring the variable var. The name of the variable is student, and we're assigning it a value with equals. The value we're assigning is this object. This is an object literal. Object literals start with curly braces and end with curly braces. Inside, you have a name of a property, a colon, and a value. It doesn't have to be a string. It can be other objects. You can have nested objects. You can have another object that's like this. Or something like that. Right, so you have nested objects there. We're not going to get into all that, but the point is you have a property and a value, and the value can be any expression, anything that boils down to a value. So expressions can go here because they boil down to a single value. Alright, so it has an ID, it's like a 991 number, and then an email. Alright, so this is an object. To access the properties of an object, you use the accessor operator. It's the dot. We've seen that a lot. Console.log. Console is an object that has a property called log. That's a function. So console.log. So here we're logging a student, and the name of the student is student.name. It's going to access this name property in student. And it has an email address of student.email. Student dot accesses the property email. Okay, so the dot means look inside the student object for the following property name. Okay, so save that and we'll run that. Oh yeah, can't have this because it's an error. Student blah 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 has an email address of blah 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 sycamores. Right. So it filled in the student's name here. Okay. This whole thing is a JavaScript expression. Okay. If we look back up, JavaScript expression is any valid set of literals, variables, operators, and other expressions. So here we have a literal string, the concatenation operator, the plus symbol for strings. We have a variable, student, and a property on that variable. And then another operator, another string literal, another operator, and another variable. Okay, so this entire thing is an expression, and JavaScript, the way it executes this line of code, is when it sees an expression, it has to evaluate that first before it calls the function. So this whole thing is the first argument. There's only one argument to this console.log function, but it's an expression. Okay, I could do the same thing with var log message, and I could set that equal to this whole expression. So the variable will equal the result of this expression boiling down to one long string. And then I can console.log log message. It's the same thing. So the entire expression, this way we stored it in a variable and logged it. Okay. Here I'm just logging the student. So logging this object so you can see what it looks like in Node when you log an object. If the object's too big, Node condenses it so you don't get to see everything. Okay. This is an array. An array has a series of, an array is basically a series of data, but it's unnamed data. Okay, so these would be like test scores or something. So you've got 4 test scores, second one, third one, and fourth one. Okay, scores. Arrays have a special property too, dot length. So arrays are objects. They're just a special kind of object, and one of the things that makes them special is they have this property. Oops. Okay, so that tells you how many items are in the array. There's 4 items in the array, and it's these 4 items. Okay. Okay, so now this is an expression. This is the most complicated expression we've come across. Okay, so we have an object literal plus this expression. This is an expression because we put it in parentheses. When it's in parentheses like this, it's like order of operations in mathematics. You always evaluate what's in parentheses first. Okay, so we look in those parentheses and see what we have. Okay, so that is this expression. Alright, but we've got parentheses in there, so the first thing we're looking at, basically, is we're adding these four scores together. So this is the innermost section of parentheses. So this expression gets evaluated first. It adds up all those scores, and that's going to be some value. It returns a single value. Once that expression is evaluated, then we go over here and we take that and divide it by 4. Okay? Then this expression has been evaluated. This is an arithmetic expression because now we're using math. These are numbers, they're decimals, but they don't have quotes, notice, so it's not strings, so the plus isn't concatenation, it's actually addition. So scores plus score 0 is the first element. So in the array, you use square brackets, and then you start numbering at 0. 0 means the first one, 1 means the second one, and 2 means the third one. So basically we add up all 4, we divide by 4, and that should give us the average. So this whole thing is a number. And then we have this string literal, and we add it to the number. In JavaScript, whenever you have a string in the expression with the plus sign, it turns the other value into a string for you. A lot of programming languages don't do that for you. It's really a nice feature, but it based on what it thinks you're doing, it will change the value or the type of the data that you provide it. So here, this is a number, but it's automatically converting it to a string and then concatenating it with this one. It's really nice, but it can also be unexpected. It can cause some problems sometimes too. So the average score was 88. Alright, so that is variables. Now we're on to operators, which we've talked about just a little bit already too. Okay, operators in JavaScript are keywords or symbols that can be used in conjunction with literals, variables, and expressions to perform an operation on the provided data, resulting in a value. All that basically means is you have some data and you have a symbol, and it takes that data and does something interesting with it. So addition is the plus operator. Okay, so 2 plus 5 equals, this is an expression. We have a number literal and an operator and a number literal. This expression will evaluate to a number. Okay, so the operator took a left-hand side piece of data and a right-hand side piece of data and did something interesting with it. That interesting thing that it did was addition. Okay, so that's built in to JavaScript. So there, it added it. Subtraction, it's pretty self-explanatory. It gets interesting here after division though. Okay, so we've got subtraction, multiplication, division. Now one thing to note here is look at this. On subtraction, it's 12.7 minus 5, and that should be pretty obviously 7.7, but it has to do with how data is stored in JavaScript. Data is represented in binary. We just did a lecture on binary, so you know how long those numbers get. And so basically what happens is in binary, like in base 10, our decimal system, if you do 1 divided by 3, you get 0.3 repeating. You get these repeating decimals. Okay, in binary, things don't repeat in the same places that they do in decimal system. Okay, so sometimes the numbers will repeat and then it'll get rounded off at a place that we wouldn't normally think it would get rounded off in the decimal system. So it's still really, really close. It's just not entirely accurate. It's not entirely what you would think it would be. It's because it converts everything to binary first and then performs the operations and then rounds the result. Okay, so you'll get really, really close data, but it's not entirely accurate. So that is something to be cautious of. That can bite you sometimes. All right. So after division here, this one is interesting. This is the modulus operator. It's the percentage sign. So basically what that is the remainder when you divide. So this one here, we did division. 1024 divided by 24 is 42 and some change. Right? So if we want to know exactly how many of those objects were in the remainder after we divided, we use modulus. Okay, so there were 16 left over after dividing 24 as many times as you can in 1024. Okay, so that one's kind of handy for some of the math stuff. And then this is a new one in one of the latest releases of JavaScript. ECMAScript standard is what it's called. The exponentiation symbol. It's 2 multiplication symbols. The multiplication symbol is an asterisk. That's if you do shift and the number 8 key. Alright, so exponentiation is like powers, and you use 2 of those in a row. So 16 to the 3rd power equals, so this is an expression that should evaluate. This is the operator. It takes a left-hand side piece of data and a right-hand side piece of data. Okay, not all operators do that. Some operators only take one piece of data. We'll get into that later. But operators take in data and they do something interesting with it. It's similar to a function. It's kind of like shorthand for a function. Okay, because we could write an add function here that's return the value. We take 2 numbers, x and y, and return x plus y. Alright, so if we did console.log 2 plus 5, and instead of this expression we did add 2 and 5, that's the same thing, right? So a lot of these operators are just shorthand, so you don't have to call functions all the time. And they're common things that you do in almost all your programs. Okay. So these were all number operators. Now we have string concatenation, which we've already talked about, but it's a string literal. Now strings can actually be defined using double quotes, single quotes, and backticks. Backticks, the key for a backtick is to the left of your number 1 key. Alright, and this is a backticks. The reason for the double quotes and the string quotes is so it's easier for you if you have, like in this case, I actually want to print out the character double quote. So I use single quotes so I wouldn't close it. If I had double quotes here, it would think this is the string. And it's not. So you can escape it with a backslash, and so now that is actually a double quote in the string. But sometimes it gets hard to read with all the escape characters. So it's similar to HTML, how there's an escape sequence. In strings, there's an escape sequence for stuff, but we won't go into all that right now. Okay, but you can define strings with double quotes, single quotes, or backticks. Let's give this one final go. There we go. Concatenation takes the string and adds it together. Alright, so you've already seen a lot of this stuff, and I wanted to expose you to some of the neater things with HTML and the canvas and all that. Now coming back to all of this should really help tie things together, and we're going to be doing more programs like this that are just in Node, do some math stuff and some more interesting stuff like that. But that's all going to apply to if you decide to make a website, or your final project is going to be something with HTML too, so it's all going to be useful. So anyway, that's all we have for JavaScript expressions.